Good afternoon. Once again, you guys are joining Reasonable Faith for another monthly installment of our book study. We have been working through this book. I actually brought it this time because I feel like I've been talking about it and you guys may never have seen it. So we are, as an organization, going through Blackwell's Companion, and we have had the pleasure of having the authors of this book join us every month to talk about their contributions. This month is no different, thanks to Charles. We have Dr. Stewart Goetz here on the call with us. Dr. Stewart is a professor of philosophy who holds a Litt from Oxford University and a Ph.D. from Notre Dame. He has authored and edited many books, some of which include on subjects such as the freedom and determinism, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion. And today, Dr. Goetz is going to be helping us work through the problem of evil, which I'm sure everyone on this call, this will be one of those real relatable topics this month. So without any further ado, Dr. Goetz.
Well, John, thank you very much. Charles, again, thanks for inviting me. You should all know I wrote this probably 14 or 15 years ago. The problem of evil is not my first interest. I largely do work in philosophy of mind, freedom of the will, and J.P. Moreland and William Craig asked me if I'd write this chapter, and I did in the end say yes, obviously, with some fear and trepidation. Problem of evil is something one doesn't talk about lightly, and because we've all been sufferers of evil, some of us a lot more than others. So what I have to say, I say humbly. I'm no really why me to talk about this. A little background. When I wrote the piece, I was just beginning to get seriously interested in the topic, the meaning of life. Contemporary philosophy, analytic philosophy, is a discipline that has become increasingly over the decades ruled by a view called naturalism. And naturalism, it seemed to me, if it's in its strongest form, would actually say there is no problem of evil because there is no evil. And I'll explain why I think it entails that in just a minute. But then as I got into the meaning of life, analytic philosophy had largely suppressed or discouraged discussion of the topic for decades, coming out of logical positivism. And I tried to, I don't know, in some ways, bring the topic back into the profession for serious discussion. And my recent work has been in the area of the meaning of life. Finally, you should know, at the same time I was writing this piece for this book, I was also seriously, for the first time in my life, reading C.S. Lewis. I'd never read much C.S. Lewis. I went for a fall break with my wife up to Massachusetts, and just thought for reading I would purchase just a few books by Lewis, paperbacks, because I, again, never read Lewis seriously, and discovered that I thought he was a philosopher. In what I read, turns out he was trained in philosophy at Oxford, and it turned out I think I had it was fair to say that I shared a lot of Lewis's views, and have gone on to write a couple books about Lewis, treating him as a philosopher. So what about the problem of evil? Well, as I wrote the piece, four kind of common sense, I think, supernaturalist points. First, the problem of evil, I take it, is, as Lewis said, the problem of pain. He wrote a book on the problem of evil. He could have entitled the book The Problem of Evil, but it was interesting to me, he entitled it the problem of pain. And Lewis, like I, believe pain is evil. And when we say it's evil, we just mean that it's bad. And Lewis and I would hold that it's intrinsically evil. Contemporary philosophy, strong naturalism, basically wants to get rid of what I would call the ouchiness of pain. As I did philosophy of mind, analytic philosophers, naturalists, wanted to functionalize pain. They wanted to try and capture pain in terms of causal inputs and causal outputs, and somehow leave out the intrinsic nature of pain. Well, I was convinced you leave out the intrinsic nature of pain, you're not even going to have a problem of evil, because you've left out what causes the problem of evil. It's hurtfulness. You can't even really describe it except as ouchiness or hurt. So we need to reject a strong naturalist view of pain. We need to insist that pain does have an intrinsic nature. It hurts, and it's this that Lewis claims screams at us. Secondly, another supernaturalist element in problem of evil is pain occurs, I believe, in souls, and so that we're all souls, and we have the capacity to experience pain, but it's not our bodies that experiences pain, it's we as souls. Thirdly, I'm a libertarian. I believe there is libertarian free will. As we'll see in a minute, though, I don't think that it's a good that justifies the existence of evil. But I am a libertarian, and I think you need libertarian freedom to adequately address the problem of evil. And then finally, there are genuine purposes in life, and I believe there is a purpose of life. When one gets into the meaning of life literature, probably one of the most widely accepted interpretations of the meaning of life is the purpose of life. And so I was convinced that to think of the problem of evil was, you had to think about the purpose of life. So that what then, I asked myself when I was writing this, and what is the purpose of life? And I think the purpose of life is that we be perfectly happy. I think the Christian tradition has, to some extent, lost sight of this. And because when I bring this up, people say the purpose of life is to be happy. And I said, yeah, I actually think that is the dominant view in the at least the Christian tradition with which I'm familiar. I'll just read a couple things here I pulled out. I don't have this in the chapter in the book, but Boethius, he said, the whole concern of men, which the effort of a multitude of pursuits keeps busy, moves by different roads, yet strives to arrive at one and the same end, that of happiness. In all of these things, it is obviously happiness alone that's desired. For whatever a man seeks above all else, that he reckons the highest good. But we have defined the highest good as happiness, wherefore each man judges that state to be happy, which he desires above all others. Anselm, just read here, it ought not to be doubted that the nature of rational beings was created by God in order that through rejoicing in him, it might be blessedly happy. Man, being rational by nature, was created to that end. Through rejoicing in God, he might be blessedly happy. God made man for the purpose of eternal happiness. I could quote Aquinas here, Calvin, but I'll go to my favorite author, C.S. Lewis. What are we born for? For infinite happiness. And Lewis wrote that infinite, complete, ecstatic happiness is the life of the blessed. It is the end. So to frame the problem of evil, I think we need to frame it within the context of what is the purpose of life. If we are created to be perfectly happy, then evil is something that doesn't seem to fit with the idea of happiness. But now to say the purpose of life is to be happy leaves wide open the question, well, just what is happiness? And happiness, I think, broadly speaking, falls, construals or understandings of it fall within two general categories. The first is what we would call the eudaemonist tradition. The eudaemonist tradition tends to see happiness as some type of activity, whether it be intellectual activity, contemplation, or in some sense, even moral activity. The other major understanding of happiness is a hedonistic understanding of happiness, where happiness is the experience of pleasure. Now, it's important, I think, to distinguish, because when I raise this topic, I often get looks of horror. I'm a Christian, and I say, you know, I believe perfect happiness is the experience of nothing but pleasure, and people give me these looks. In professional philosophy, hedonism is the view that there's one and only one intrinsic good, and that intrinsic good is taken to be the experience of pleasure. There's one and only one intrinsic evil, and that intrinsic evil is the experience of pain. One can have a hedonistic understanding of happiness without being, strictly speaking, a hedonist, so that one can think the hedonist has got it right, that happiness is the experience of pleasure, but unlike the hedonist, also affirm that there is at least one additional intrinsic good. And Lewis and I would agree about that. We believe justice is also an intrinsic good. Why plump for, why go for the hedonistic understanding of happiness over the eudaimonistic understanding of happiness? Primarily because it seemed to Lewis, and it seems to me, the hedonistic understanding of happiness is intuitively the most plausible. While it's true we experience pleasure through our actions, the experience of pleasure and the experience of pain are both actually passions that we undergo. When we experience pleasure and pain, we are passive with respect to these experiences. They happen to us, even though we often act to have them. Nevertheless, we are actually patient with respect to these experiences. And I think this plays nicely into the Christian understanding of salvation and the purpose of life, as I'll explain here briefly in just a moment. I am a libertarian, as I've said earlier, but I don't believe libertarian freedom is an intrinsic good. I believe people like Plantinga, when they would do his free will defense, people like Al would think that freedom is some type of justifying good. It justifies the permission, God's permission of evil. I don't think that's the case. Rather, I think in order for God to act justly with respect to us in the purpose of life, he has to give us libertarian freedom. And the libertarian freedom is important because perfect happiness is such a great good. It's the good for us that only those who act justly deserve to experience perfect happiness. And so we need libertarian freedom as a condition of justly experiencing perfect happiness. Now, in the Christian tradition, I take it the incarnation death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus are at the heart of the solution to the problem of evil. And here I was greatly influenced by Lewis. Our libertarian freedom is essentially a choice we have to make about whether we will die to self and or choose to pursue happiness on our own terms. And the Christian tradition, I think, affirms rightly that in order to experience the happiness for which we were created, we must die to self and receive the happiness for which we were created as a gift. The problem of evil arises because we were given the freedom to choose, to make this choice. And sin is basically the choice to pursue the happiness for which we are created on our own terms. And we want to make ourselves happy when it's the case that God will never allow us to make ourselves happy. Only God can make us happy, and we must choose death to self. So that when I thought about the incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus, it seemed to me this was a perfect illustration of the truth that God was illustrating that we must die to self in order to rise again for the happiness that we were created to experience. So the solution to the problem of evil, it seems to me, generally speaking, is to recognize that we are created for a purpose, something the naturalist denies. The naturalist says there is no purpose of life. We are created for a purpose. Evil is brought upon, at least in part, by our own evil choices, our own immoral choices, our own sinful choices, because we want to pursue happiness on our own terms as opposed to dying to ourselves to receive that for which we were created. Charles, a couple of weeks ago, sent me just a question here. Somebody raised, and Charles says, "Why don't you deal with the question in your initial presentation?" So let me just read the question, and I'll give you kind of my answer to it, and that should, I think, in a way, illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of my idea about the solution to the problem of evil. Just quoting here now, my main question relates to the idea of desiring personal happiness. While I appreciate that you don't spend a lot of time describing all the aspects of personal happiness in my piece in the book, the writer says, my concern is that it could appear somewhat hedonistic. The person who wrote this was absolutely right. My view is a hedonistic view of happiness, although I'm not a hedonist. The Christian theist would presumably wish to talk about the communion of the saints in the sense of all believers in Christ and the relationships that we would enjoy, both with God and with them. Also, should our primary happiness not be found in glorifying God for all eternity rather than desiring pleasurable experiences? And I guess I would say in response to this, yeah, a Christian hedonist about happiness readily agrees that the idea of perfect happiness will only be found in communion with the saints and with worshiping and in worshiping God. Indeed, the worship of God, I believe, is a source of pleasure, as is thanking God. The question states that we enjoy others and God, and I take enjoying others and God to be experiencing pleasure with and through them. A hedonist about happiness maintains that happiness can be found through the worship and of God and the fellowship of the saints. I don't see any problem there. And I believe our being happy actually glorifies God, as Lewis said at one point. Happiness has the scent, the odor of deity about it, so that whenever we experience pleasure, we are in the very presence of God. So that's a general overview, James, John. I'll just stop there and just throw it open if anybody has any comments or questions.
So good. Oh my gosh. I'm so excited. For anyone who's watched any of these, I'm easily excited. I think my spirit animal is a Labrador Retriever. So I just really, really appreciate that opening, Dr. Goetz. Once again, if you're just tuning into the recording, you are watching the Reasonable Faith International Directors Team, our monthly book study. Chapter 8 was written by this fine fellow, Dr. Stewart Goetz, on the problem of evil some years ago, and he has graced us with his presence to further expound his thoughts on his piece. Yeah, I think for me, I'm really sitting with what you're saying about happiness. I'm going to have to meditate on that. I would be curious to know, you said you wrote this some time ago,
Yes.
a decade and a half ago or so. What new developments around the problem of evil, if you were approached today to write a new piece on the problem of evil, would you add anything? Where have you moved in your thinking with this piece?
Yeah, were I to rewrite it, John, I think I would definitely approach it now through the lens of the purpose of life. This is a topic, seriously, about 30 years ago, you could hardly find anybody in analytic philosophy that would tackle the topic, would even allow it to be raised. They would just joke, well, the meaning of life, what's the meaning of the word life? And that was taken to be a serious rebuttal to even considering the topic. Just wrote a book with Joshua Seacrest recently, came out last year. What is this thing called the meaning of life? Routledge asked us to write an introductory text on this. And we formulated it in terms of what we call the meaning triad. And there's a general consensus, philosophers rarely agree about anything, but there is a general consensus among philosophers that the meaning of life question is essentially a group of three questions. The one is, what is the purpose of life? Which I've explained here would be, in the Christian tradition I'm familiar with, is happiness. Secondly, what makes life worth living? So when somebody asks the question, what's the meaning of life? They might be asking us, well, what makes life worth living? And as a hedonist about happiness, the answer to this would be, well, happiness is what makes life worth living. And that links up with the very purpose of life for which we were created by God to enjoy. And then the third part of the triad, the meaning triad, is how, if at all, do things ultimately make sense? And so the meaning of life question is a making sense of things. How do things fit together? Do they fit together ultimately in some intelligible way? And I take the problem of evil to be probably the greatest challenge, that things don't fit together the right way. Evil presents this piece of a puzzle, and you're trying to fit it in there, and if this life is the only life we have to lead, it seems like there's no way to make sense ultimately out of things. And so if I were to write the chapter today, I would definitely, I think, approach it more through the meaning of life issue. Because the problem of evil, it seems to me, ultimately has to itself be fit into that context.
Wonderful. Well, and I know us as academics love a good, clean framework, but I think this framework is fairly intuitive to anyone.
Yeah, I think it is. That's the power of it in a way.
Right. As you've presented it. And I think, to your point, when something is fairly intuitive, it's got long-reaching applications. Okay, so The next question, I'm going to turn it over to Ian. Ian is, for those of you that have watched any of these, Ian is, man, you're like my right-hand man now, Ian. I don't know. Well, okay, so I'm like,
on that side, you see.
Yeah, no, okay, so I'm Charles' right-hand man. You're mine. Okay, I don't know how this goes. So Ian, introduce yourself, please. Where are you from, and then your question, please.
Yeah, well, I'm a Reasonable Faith chapter director in South Wales. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, so I'm living in Swansea. It was quite funny when we had our first one of these sessions with Charles Taliaferro. He was talking about, is it DZ? I can't remember his name now. There's a Swansea School of Philosophy, apparently, which I'd never heard of. So I was a little embarrassed to say that. But
well, I'm with you.
It's the introduction to the book, and he's talking about, is it DZ Phillips or something? I can't remember.
Oh yeah.
Well, apparently he dropped dead in the library just 3 miles east of where I'm sitting right now. So I thought that was a sort of a slightly inauspicious start to the series, but so
yeah, Charles is full of stories like that.
Yeah, so he was rebutting his points really. So well, you've actually answered my main question, because that was my question that you just addressed. So but I thought maybe it'd be worth just kind of following up, because as Reasonable Faith chapter directors, we try to apply what we learn through these studies, through studying Dr. Craig's material, obviously, and through these books, and it's been a fantastic opportunity to have all the authors talk to us. And I think hearing you explain it made it much clearer to me, rather than just obviously trying to read through it. So in terms of an apologetic, well, first of all, I thought very interesting on naturalism, and just the whole point, well, what is evil if you're just a naturalist? And we don't seem to push back on that enough.
Yeah, I think absolutely we don't.
So that is a bit of a nugget there at the beginning. Actually, we'll say, well, you don't believe there is God, so why even start on the problem of evil? It just doesn't even get off the ground in some respects. But I just wanted to look a bit more at the sort of aspects of personal happiness. One of the things that Jordan Peterson says is the purpose of life is not to seek happiness, and if we're going to seek happiness, that's going to be just the wrong thing to do in life, because you're going to be disappointed. And he says the most important thing is to have a purpose in life. And I think that's actually a fundamental point, really, having a purpose. So, but I think I just wonder if you sort of maybe expand a little bit on that, because clearly when he's talking about personal happiness, he's talking about not finding it in drink and drugs and sex and
right,
things like that. Just trying to get personal, because I think you talked a bit about most of the earthly pleasures we're rejecting God's offer. So I think people can get confused about the idea of personal happiness and its fulfillment through God, rather than seeking it on earth. So if you want personal happiness, why not get it now? Exactly. As opposed to sort of deferring it, I suppose. I think it's interesting that you tie it up with the concept of evil. I don't know if that's just too vague for you to expand on.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, actually, the classic hedonists like John Stuart Mill, he had a mental breakdown just as a child, and his father just kept pushing him, and then he. I say a child, he was in his teens, and so, as a young adult, child's not the right word there, but, because he was on basically a mission altruistically in a way to make people happy or whatever, and he collapsed mentally. And he came to the conclusion that if you want to be happy, you cannot make happiness the object of your pursuits. It's a self-defeating enterprise, basically, is the way what he concluded. And so, when people hear the word hedonism about happiness, the mind, for whatever reason, seems to go, oh, you're just going to start and pursue happiness in any way, which way you want. And actually, even the hedonists came to the conclusion that was the wrong way to go about this. So while we're created for the purpose this is a divinely instilled purpose, and it's because happiness is good that it makes sense to think we're created for this. Nevertheless, we have to die to the idea of we can make ourselves happy. And so our purposes on earth, I think generally for everybody, the idea of the death of self is we're all called to be moral. We're all called to live what we would think of as a moral life. And we have to just trust God to open ourselves to God to, if there's something special, in some sense of, vocation or whatever, we have to wait upon God to give that to us. So that you can't sit there every day thinking, I'm going to make happiness my goal. It just won't work. Because we really can't figure out how to make ourselves happy. I mean, this is just it resonates through the tradition. Kant knew this, Lewis knew this, Mill knew this, everybody knows. You sit out around there and try and figure out how you're going to make yourself happy. No matter what you do, it could turn out in the end that you just end up not being happy. So that the purpose of life, although it's happiness, the Christian message is you die to self in order to actually receive this. And you find this even in Buddhist and Hindu traditions. I mean, they spin it the wrong way, though. They think you actually have to deny the existence of the self, and you deny all pursuits of any kind whatsoever, the fruits, the rewards. And Lewis, when he was a young man, he was reading about the Buddha, and he said, well, we in the Christian tradition, we're more commonsensical. We affirm the existence of the self. So we're gonna part ways with the Hindu and the Buddhist who renounce the self. I'm sure there are forms of Hinduism, I'm not a Hindu specialist, that will affirm the self, but the Buddha, basically, you don't even exist as a substance that persists through time. But even they recognize this kernel of truth, that there has to be some kind of renunciation if we're actually going to be happy in any legitimate sense of the word happiness. That was a long-winded response to a great question. I've been in Oxford the last 5 years. I co-teach a seminar with a guy named Timothy Mawson, and we went to Wales, my wife and I, one holiday. We just loved Wales.
Yeah. Well, and I think we all love Wales now because of Ian. Before this, but now I have to get to Wales. So once again, if you're just now jumping in to the call, to the recording, if this is your first time touching any of these things, you will be surprised to know that we believe that God wrote two books, the book of scripture and the book of nature. And we believe that you can understand them both to a certain degree. And so what we try to do here at Reasonable Faith, under the tutelage of Dr. William Lane Craig, is we try to have these discussions about the most pressing issues of life to better understand how the scripture and nature work in concert with one another. And this month, Dr. Stewart Goetz is here helping us along with probably, I think many would agree with me, the stickiest ball of wax between the two, which is why do we see so much evil and brokenness in the world? And how do we understand the problem of evil? So the next question comes from a man you already well know, Dr. Goetz, Mr. Charles. So Charles, if you want to unmute and present your question.
Thank you today
let's be clear though, John. I know Charles about 5 minutes before I met you.
Okay. That means you guys go all the way back. Good.
Go all the way back.
All the way back.
Yeah.
Our friendship is measured in seconds.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Goetz. Since you've got some background of this philosophy of mind, this may be home run for you, but just thinking about the interplay between the problem of pain / evil and maybe a philosophy of mind approach of epiphenomenalism, where consciousness kind of just arises from complex brain matter.
Yes.
How would you navigate those two positions and show the weakness of an epiphenomenalistic approach?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, epiphenomenalism is just so counterintuitive. The idea that mental properties or events and qualitative properties, events are caused by, but never themselves enter into a causal story that goes back to those material events themselves. It's just so counterintuitive. So no, I would say, Charles, nobody starts an epiphenomenalist. They need some kind of argument to get them there, because it just seems to us that we act for purposes. And when we think, this was Lewis's argument from reason, when we think, our mental thoughts are producing events, with the best evidence we have in our brains. So I would always start with mental physical interactionism. Epiphenomenalism is surely a position to which one has to be argued. And then I'd want to know, what is the argument? Why would anybody say anything like that and affirm anything like epiphenomenalism? And in the end, in today's philosophical world, the analytic community at least, the reason that's typically given is you can't do science if you affirm the mental affects the physical. And then you want to say, well, what do you mean you can't do science? Well, we need to assume causal closure in order to do science, so that we need to assume the physical world is causally closed in order to methodologically do our scientific work. And at that point, I said, well, maybe you need to assume causal closure within the context of doing your science, but I see no reason whatsoever to think that the world is universally causally closed. So that epiphenomenalism is just so initially counterintuitive. Well, why would anybody believe it? And then you have to listen, I think, to what arguments they put forth. Taliaferro, you mentioned Charles Taliaferro, John. Taliaferro and I wrote a book together called Naturalism, and we address the causal closure argument in naturalism. So, Charles, I think it's all wrapped up with causal closure principle, at least in the contemporary context.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I think that as we start to look to land this plane here, some final thoughts. I'm curious, as we've shifted to talk more so about happiness, maybe than a polemic towards evil or the structure and nature of evil or something to that degree, could you maybe, and bear with me here, articulate from your stance somewhat of a theology of play? I know it feels to me that play, right, has some interplay with happiness. And I think when Jürgen Moltmann wrote his piece, which is out of print, but still very pricey for the text because of how rare it is, I don't think anyone's really done anything with that sense about, like, objectively, where does play fit into how God would normatively ask us to orchestrate our lives? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't have any deep thoughts about it. I tend to, the little we can say about the idea of heaven, the afterlife, the felicity, beatitude, or I tend to think, John, of it as, in some sense, it's going to be a riot. It's going to be play. Lewis, and this is again Lewis. I've been greatly influenced by Lewis. Lewis thinks we all get too consumed by thinking the end of life is to be moral, and Lewis said, no, the end of life isn't to be moral. Certainly, we all ought to be moral. We all ought to die to self, but death of the self is not an end in itself. We only die to self because it's the right thing to do, and the result of that is happiness. Play. I mean, most of us in life, in this world, we play to get pleasure, and there are legitimate forms of play, and we all, desire them. As an academic, people often ask me, Stewart, why are you in academia? And most people are suspicious of me just from the word, especially the Christian community from the get-go. Oh, you're in academia? But I think we tend to think of play as something associated physically with our bodies, and rightly so. I mean, right now here in the States, the NFL is playing on Sunday afternoon and people are playing. But there's also mental lives. We have mental lives, and the life of the mind is a great source of pleasure. And so when I sit down to read, for me, which I love to do, it's a form of mental play. And I write. To me, it's a great gift in life. I write, and I've been blessed to be able to write because it's, in a way, its own form of play. I enjoy it. And so, yeah, I don't know Moltmann's work. You're far ahead of me on that. But yeah, why not think that the purpose of life is divinely ordained play?
Yeah, I think that I've been really fascinated recently, and personally, and then also professionally, in what some of the barriers to health, especially emotionally, for leaders. And I really have come to find Peter Scazzero's work somewhat provocative. And one of the things that he talks about, he's a pastor 20 years in New York City. Okay. Who went on to create a series called Emotionally Healthy Leadership, which is wildly successful in many churches, where he criticizes leaders that only appear on the surface to be healthy emotionally, but are actually down below very, very sick. And one of the things he talks about is how to integrate weakness into your leadership, the parts of your life that maybe are less comfortable. And I think that some of the pain we experience can be from us trying to conform. Right. Like from Richard Rohr wrote a book called Falling Upward, and he talks about the two phases of life, which is actually from Carl Jung. But this idea that like we can try to fit in so much that we're not even willing to explore what we want to play, or and so then we kind of march along to the drudgery because we think that's what we ought to do. So I find what you're saying a great kind of segue. Two final questions here. Charles sent me something. We'd love to know what you're working on now, as we look to wrap up. Is there anything that you're currently working on that you can drop any hints, any goodies for the listeners?
Well, thank you for asking. I just pretty much finished a book manuscript. Whether anybody's going to take it or not, I don't know. But I've written 2 books on Lewis. This will be my 3rd. And I've become very interested in higher education and the purpose of higher education. And largely today, people think, most of the students I teach here, John, why do you go to university? Why do you go to college? Well, to get a job. Why do you go to university or college? Well, to change society. Why do you go to university? And people keep trotting out all these. Well, you go because you want to. The government needs you to work for it. Lewis's view was higher education, which he viewed as a form of culture. The purpose of it is enjoyment, and there's no better reason to be involved in higher education than that you enjoy it. And so I constantly tell my students, their attitude seems to be, well, I'm going to grind it out for 4 years in order to get my job, in order to make my money, to be happy. And I say, well, look, I'm a hedonist about happiness, but you're approaching it the wrong way. There's no guarantee at all that when you get out, you're going to finally be happy. Why not think you should be in university, in college, because you enjoy it? And don't we all want vocations or jobs that we enjoy? And that was Lewis's view. Higher education, the primary purpose of it is enjoyment that comes from intellectual activity. And so I've just spent the last, probably 18 months writing this. And so that's been my major area of interest in the recent
Thank
year.
you.
Oh my gosh, that is just so huge. I think we all on this call, I'm getting messages from people as you're talking. It just so resonates with this group, right? I mean, we feel weird for liking. I'm 3 classes away from finishing a master's degree here, and I just when I'm in the studies, I feel the purpose of happiness. When I have to pay for the studies, I feel the problem of evil. So yeah. I just so appreciate how you articulated that. Last question, and then we want to honor your time. I guess my hang up, Charles and I talked about this a little bit earlier. I guess my hang up, whenever we talk about happiness, Sean Carroll, 2014, Greer Herd, debate with Dr. Craig. Dr. Craig is going through, and Sean Carroll asked this question. For those of you not familiar with Sean Carroll, he's an atheist cosmologist, naturalist cosmologist, and he says, when we look around and we observe kind of the things that are going on, and then we take some kind of theory of any kind, any ideological position, and we look at that theory, we take it to its logical conclusion, and we say, what should we observe if this theory was true? And we compare it to what we do see. How big is the gap, right? And then he goes through this exercise with Dr. Craig where he says, how would you expect the world to look on naturalism? And how would you expect the world to look on theism? And he kind of walks us through, and he makes a case. What we see is what you'd expect on naturalism. This is kind of his case. And so I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here for you. I think that with happiness, right, especially if we go to a global context, so many of our people in our organization live all over the world.
Right.
We can say there's a lot of unhappiness right now, especially for our fellow Christians, right? Venezuela, Turkey, Yemen, right? Haiti. Can you speak to, and even in scripture, right? The Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith, they got in there because their journeys were marked with suffering. Mm-hmm. So if the purpose of life is happiness, and yet we can observe so much rampant unhappiness, can you speak to why that is? Is the purpose something that's unreachable, or have we missed something? Can you help us out there? Because I'm sure many of the listeners today, they want happiness, but many of them probably feel like it's eluded them.
Well, it's probably, I don't want to seem trite here in any way. I mean, these are such serious issues, but we observe it, so much pain and suffering in our world because we insist on trying to make ourselves happy. We insist on trying to get happiness in our own way. And we refuse. We choose not to die to self. And if we would die to self, I think we would see a radically different world. But we live in a world, John, where the last thing people want to choose to do is to die to self. I mean, you tell anybody, well, no, don't do that. Well, why not? Well, you shouldn't get pleasure in that way. And then they just get incensed, you know, and I mean, that's the theological term is sin, you know. So it's not surprising we see the world we see, because number one, it presupposes happiness is the purpose of life. Everybody implicitly knows that. So it does fit. This is what we would expect to observe because we all know people want happiness. And the Christian says, yeah, and you continually insist on demanding the right to get it in whatever way you want to get it, and at anybody's expense, and you know, the other person's expense. And the Christian message is, no, you must die to self.
Let me lean in on that a little bit. I feel the kind of a weightiness here. There are many people who are watching. Some of these videos have gotten quite a few views around the world, and there's a probability here, Professor, that somebody's going to watch this that is a victim of some kind, who something's being done at their expense. And though they are intellectual, you know, many people watch this and they're caught in horrible situations. To the person watching this, who maybe has been the victim of something horrible, or is currently the victim of something happiness, who has no concept of happiness, right? Who all they know is the unfairness of life. What message would you share with them, Professor?
Well, honest, John, I think they have a concept of happiness. The fact that they're suffering, they're miserable. They know there's something better. I don't know. That's like, it's so personal that I'm reluctant just to give some kind of blanket statement to that in response to your question. Not because I'm trying to avoid it, but somebody, if I make say too much there, they'll say, well, you know, who are you to be? You don't know my situation, and I really don't. But we have to be willing to forgive that we've been wronged, and but St. Paul says you never try to overcome evil with evil. We have to try and remain faithful and be good. But I don't know. I'm just reluctant to tread much on that area. Step into that because it's so serious. It's so hard. And we all know we have deep hurts, and I just don't want to lightly comment on that. If you respect my, my silence there.
Of course, and I think your silence. I actually want to encourage you in that. I think your silence is a good answer in the sense of I think what's caused much harm to people is the light answer, is the quick answer, is the brush it off and get over it. And I think our viewers will appreciate how thoughtful you've been. So if you guys can just help me just thank Dr. Goetz for just a wonderful interview. It's never easy talking about evil. So and I applaud you for courageously and yet so humbly modeling for us as directors how we ought to conduct ourselves when we're talking about the same topic. So once again, this month a little heavier, but this is the Reasonable Faith International Directors Book Study. This month, we're talking about the problem of evil, and we had the perfect guy to do it. Dr. Stewart Goetz just handled it with such grace and with such poise and with such precise articulation of his terminology. So join us again next month. We'll be studying Chapter 9, and we are excited as we finish this book. We're going to be we've got some secrets in the future for you guys. Next month, we're talking about religious experience, but we plan on continuing to provide this content so long as the Lord provides. And we will see you all next month. Thank you so much.
John, may I just have the last word? Thank you.
Of course.
You're very